Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody in the room with us today and everybody on the Zoom call. Thank you for joining us. I'm Johanna Hutchison. I'm the Executive Director of the International Sculpture Centre, publisher of Sculpture magazine. And our organisation was founded in 1960 to support artists and the form of sculpture. The organisation was created to advance the creation and understanding of sculpture and its vital contribution to society. Among many of our programs, we honour excellence, choosing students at the beginning of their careers to recognise them to a Lifetime Achievement Award and everybody in between. We have programs such as conferences, virtual programming now, online panels, and we're absolutely delighted to be back together in person and having an in-person panel, so we're very excited about that. I want to thank Jerry and Barbara Wind for opening their house today. Thank you very much. It's very much appreciated, and for sharing their wonderful collection. Thank you to John for getting everyone in this room together and bringing this opportunity in partnership with collectors, curators, museums, and those that just love art. None of us exist on our own. The art exists with everybody together in harmony. Partnerships are a wonderful way to remind us of the essential partnerships that we really all need. So today I'm really excited to present this panel, and I'd like to introduce our panelists that will be speaking today. We're going to start with Marie Nevelson here. She's the founder and executive director of the Louise Nevelson Foundation, located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The foundation was established for her grandmother in May of 2005 with a mission to educate and celebrate the life of the work of artist Louise Nevelson, a pioneering 20th century sculptor whose signature Black sculpture creations of assembled wood objects transcend space and transform the viewer. Nevelson LLC was established by Maria in 1998, and she has created interiors for senior living facilities, residences, sculpted wood assemblages, and licensed the artwork of Louise Nevelson. Maria's own work has been seen on CNN TV's Style with Elsa Clench in the permanent collection of the University of Cambridge's Paul Art Collection, the jewelry collaboration with the Paris fashion house, Celine too. That's Maria. John is a mixed media artist, creating narrative portraits and assemblage with objects collected from his own life and his own subjects. He is also founder of the Maximal Art Inc., known for its modern vintage fashion jewelry and gifts sold under the Dina Wind brand. His work is in permanent collections at the Victoria Albert Museum in London, the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, and the Philadelphia Art Museum. When his mother Dina Wind passed away in 2014, the Wind family established the Dina Wind Art Foundation in her memory. John is the president of the foundation, whose mission is to ensure Dina's legacy while supporting living artists and art lovers, empowering differences and transforming lives. And it's really John coming in conversation with me that started this whole thing going. So we're very excited about it. Thank you, John. A great connector. And then lastly, but not least, Erica Battle is the John Alchin and the Hal Marriott Curator of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia Museum of Art. She works with art and artists of the mid-20th century, up to today, and across painting, sculpture, performance video, and new media. She obtains her master's at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in 2006, and most recently she served as the lead curator of New Grit, Art and Philly Now, an exhibition of 25 artists with connections to Philadelphia that inaugurated PMA's new galleries for modern and contemporary art at its Frank Gehry designed expansion. So thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Joanna. We'll let Joanna go off screen, and welcome to everyone in the room. As I was saying before, our live studio audience is here with us today. And of course, we know a lot of you are online and joining via your computers, your phones, your televisions, however you might be streaming us today. So welcome to everyone. And I would just want to reiterate the thanks and appreciation for the collaboration that made it today possible in terms of ideas and bringing everyone together. So thank you, Joanna, thank you, John, and it's been such a great pleasure to get to know Maria through this process of planning and talking so much about her grandmother's work and John's mother's work in concert with each other. So to ground the conversation, I'm going to give an introduction about both artists, and then we're going to launch into some Q&A with John and Maria. And we have such a privilege today of learning about both of their works, not just through an art historical lens, but through a personal lens. So we're going to take advantage of that a little bit. And I want some good anecdotes later. So I'm going to, without further ado, introduce the artists. And I'm betting they're both known quantities to everyone in this room and everyone online, but I think it's worth kind of exploring their careers and their paths so that we also recognize how much they have in common, which is really quite extraordinary. So let's start with the great Louise Nevelson. Louise Nevelson was born in 1899 in Pereslav, a city just southeast of Kiev. When she was just 5 years old, her family moved to Rockland, Maine in the United States. After marrying in 1920, she moved to New York, where years later, she took painting and drawing classes at the Art Students League. She studied with Hans Hofmann and Diego Rivera, which drove her towards the logic of Cubism and appreciation of pre-Columbian and indigenous art. As she began her arc of her career and her art, she worked as a painter for 4 years for the Works Projects Administration, something I actually haven't really known about, starting in 1935. And it was at this time too that she started exploring sculpture. Well, sorry about that. New York in the 1940s was a fusion of influences, including later surrealism. Through group exhibitions, notably at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery, Nevelson got to meet Jimmy Ernst and his dad, Max Ernst, the great surrealist, who was also married to Peggy Guggenheim, as well as Marcel Duchamp and Piet Mondrian. In the early 1950s, she traveled to the Yucatan Peninsula and then to Guatemala and Central America, where she sees vertical totems that influence the totemic shapes seen that start to emerge in her early sculptures and installations. A 1958 gallery show called Moon Garden +1, made from groupings of her constructions with the light from windows blocked, created an environment. So it's all dark. Seen as the benchmark in Nevelson's career, and as a very meaningful contribution to the ways in which autonomous objects could, through accumulation, create a total experience. Here and elsewhere, Nevelson also included recognizable objects and found elements, giving them a uniform of black paint to transform them in her constructions. Her work was both referential, invoking the broad outlines of the New York skyscrapers and buildings, but looking to meet these forms such as clouds, trees, moon, and the atmosphere itself for inspiration, and entirely of her own making, as these forms come together in iterations that together form a new way of seeing and experiencing art. Nevelson came to one of her most iconic methods of construction in the late 1950s, the use of boxes as modular units inside of which wooden pieces, also often found and then painted the same color, could be arranged into elegant and compelling iterations, some of which she would rearrange, some of which she actually let collectors of hers rearrange, and the fun kind of interactive element. I don't know if they do that still today. This gave it 3 dimensions to the grid, articulating spatial relationships in and among these repeated containers that held their own compositions, yet were fused across the larger sculptural form with many more. Nevelson's monochromatic approach in black, white, as we see this amazing work here, or gold, emphasized the play of light and shadow. She calls herself an architect of light, creating not just sculpture to look at, but to experience phenomenologically. It was a gesture of unification that most successfully amplified the difference among her component elements. While Nevelson ultimately worked at galleries such as Pace Gallery, she attained recognition late in life. In fact, her first museum retrospective, which was in 1967 at the Whitney Museum of American Art, when she was 67 years old. And that is, in a nutshell, Louise Nevelson. There's a lot more to say, but moving on to Dina. So I did not know Louise, but I did know Dina. And I met Dina and Jerry when I first started the museum back in 2006, feels like yesterday. And I'm sure many here sitting in this room knew Dina and knew Dina very well. It strikes me that they have a few characteristics in common, such as an intrepid and bold approach to their art, and a distinctive strength of spirit that emboldened them as women pursuing artistic recognition and sculpture at a time that was traditionally male-dominated. Dina was born Vardina Luria to a Jewish Russian family in 1938 in what is now Afula, Israel, and was formerly British Mandate Palestine. After serving in the army, she studied sociology and education at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where she met Jerry, who would become her husband in 1959. John was born soon after, and a few years later, the family moved to the United States. After a stint in California, they settled in Philadelphia in 1967. Already, the Eastern European and Jewish connections bring these two artists together in their biographies, as with Dina's first introduction to painting, as she studied with Sam Feinstein, a student of Hans Hofmann, with whom Nevelson had also studied as an early influence. Dina would continue her education studying the Barnes Foundation with Violet DiMaggio for 2 years, and obtaining her master's degree in communications at the Annenberg School here at the University of Pennsylvania. It was a few years later that she discovered her penchant for welding. Welding, which is literally bringing two pieces of metal through sheer force and heat, presented endless possibilities of form that seemed liberatory compared to the canvas. She began studying with Leon Sitarchuk at the Cheltenham Art Center in the suburbs of Philadelphia. In 1983, she had her first solo exhibition at the Penn Faculty Club Gallery, and then she joined Nexus Gallery and would go on to have many shows there over her life. Like Nevelson, Dina was on the constant lookout for materials she can incorporate into her work, whether at flea markets or scrap metal yards. And her approach to incorporating them was similar in that they might be recognizable, like coils and springs and car parts, but she sought to transform them in her sculpture through formal composition and giving them a new life as art. She unified these disparate parts with varnish or paint so that her works, which really abounded with strength and energy, would appear holistic. Yet with Dina, there was no attempt at containment like Nevelson's boxes, and which Nevelson also moved away from later, which we'll talk about. The wandering lines and edges abounded and tempted the eye with endless itineraries over her metal constructions. Her work reflects herself, especially if I knew her, resolutely bold, yet undeniably elegant. So there we have Louise and Dina, who we're going to refer to in the familiar. For Dina, I feel okay. For Louise, I had to ask Maria's permission to do that. So I hope that helps kind of ground our conversation today. And we're going to move into some questions because we really want to hear from both of you. As I mentioned, each of these artists use a range of materials and approaches, but the fact of sculpture itself, both actually had a training in painting and moved to sculpture, is quite important. Nevelson has said there's something beyond 3 dimensions and call it the 4th dimension, and this is where art is. Let's start by talking about that premise. John and Maria, can you talk about Dina and Louise and why they were drawn to sculpture and the various materials that they used?
Blanking. Well, I was listening to one of my grandmother's tapes last night because that's how I revisit who she is and Maria is and my grandmother is, and so here we are. She felt she needed to work in sculpture because it was during the wartime, World War II, and she was creative needs, of course, but there was objects around on the streets and she was pulling them together. And so her earlier works are these assemblages that were not in a box, they were open and there was a bowl or, recognizable imagery. But it was this need to create through these easily accessible elements around. And then as time went on, it got more formalized. She worked, but she also brought in the 4th dimension, which you mentioned, just described that was a strong need of hers to transcend the here now 3D that we're living in and move through creativity into this other world, which is a coexisting spatial dimension that a lot of artists will experience. I have when I was doing my artwork, You can do it through meditation and through other mediums, but you feel very harmonious with your surroundings. It feels great. The bottom line is it feels great. And however you get there, go for it. But she did it through her creativity and her artwork. So she would look at putting all these assemblages together as creating a total form harmony, a totality with the universe. She's working with energy and bringing that in, because each object has energy in that, put together with another object, and then you build. It's assemblage.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
in a nutshell. Again, it's a little short clip of what she was doing, but.
And how about Dina, John? How did Dina start? I mean, we kind of heard a little bit in my synopsis about her kind of finding welding, which of course, like just through the technique of bringing of sculpture was somehow seemed to be a kind of an accelerant or a catalyst. But can you talk about her use of materials in terms of, she worked in steel and aluminum and things that, like, and so and as we look at the work, which whether it's elsewhere in this room, it's really hard stuff. Wood has a kind of interesting, and I remember reading a Nevelson quote about wood having kind of a memory to it. And these kind of found objects. In some ways, some of the metal that Dina used was also found, right? Scraps, but then the manipulation of it was quite extreme. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe we can all talk a little bit more about assemblage.
Well, for starters, I think that when Dina was a painter, she was experimenting and finding her voice as an artist. That was her introduction to being a maker. Once a friend of hers introduced her to welding and working with metal, suddenly it was a different story. It wasn't experimentation, it was this intuitive grasp that this is where I belong. And she said to us that a blank canvas, there was a level of intimidation that she didn't feel with the metal. Like, it spoke to her, she knew exactly what to do. And if you want a juicy anecdote, I'll start with one that in our family is a little bit questioning, and that is that Dina's parents owned a gas station and garage on the main truck route between Tel Aviv and Haifa. So it's clear to me that that affinity for old tools and car parts, there was something Proustian about it, and a familiarity, a comfort,
Right.
that drew her to it.
Yeah.
When I suggested that to her, though, she said, "John, you're being way too Freudian. That's not what it's about."
Right.
But that's how I saw it. And it was undeniable that the material spoke to her, and she would go to scrap metal yards looking for what she called interesting scrap. And the guys who worked there, whose job was to sort copper from brass, from steel, because everything had different dollar value, they would just laugh at her and go, "What are you looking for, lady?" And said, "I'm looking for interesting scrap." And she's like, "What does that mean?" But by the end of it, she charmed them, and they would be picking pieces up from the field and go, "Hey, Dina, is this interesting?" So there was just something about the material that from day one, and the act of assemblage, that really connected for her.
And it sounds like the way that you described Dina welding, that was her fourth dimension moment, right?
Absolutely.
This kind of feeling of an artistic nirvana, right?
Yes.
Which sounds great, by the way. It's also interesting with Nevelson, because her family, a lot of people were in her family were involved with woodworking, lumber yards, and as much as artists do sometimes artists love their kind of origin stories, and sometimes they like to push them far away, but we know better, right?
We know better. And I think, you bring up your story about your mother's family. My grandmother's father was, I don't know if he had a lumber yard, as it's been reported, but he certainly worked with wood because he was building houses in Rockland, Maine. That was how he was making a living. And so there was lumber around, and there was scraps, and so I think there was a familiarity right there, same thing.
So interesting.
And they just gravitate towards it very comfortably. Don't argue with it, but obviously they transform these things into something unbelievable. But yeah, I would say there's the same kind of connection in her earlier. And she would say also that she was building, which building cars, but she was building houses. So for her, it was all this building all the time, building, rather, build a mountain, build. So then she had Mrs. N's Palace, which was building a house. Maybe that was a Freudian thing to, her father building houses in Rockland, Maine. It's this need, though, to put this energy into something very constructive, very concrete, and realize it. And so it's I don't know, it was cool to watch, growing up, probably for you too, to see that in action. But
when did you, I'm curious, we're going to dig a little bit more into the personal, which is, when did you, Maria, kind of realize who Louise was, or what she was as an artist? Did you have time, did you get to kind of, as a child, be in a studio? What was that like?
well, actually, I wasn't in her studio as a child. When I went, she actually stopped everything, and I would go, and then she dressed me in clothes. She liked to, dress me up. My sisters too, but she was busy with the clothes and jewelry and things. But she did take me around every visit from as little as I can remember and show me everything that she was working on. And the house was always filled because it was her studio and her home. So you always saw new sculptures, and there were new materials at times, and she made sure that I saw them, and she explained them if I had questions, and sort of just in awe. And then I'm trying to, so when I really knew that she was somebody was when I was 7. So in 1967, she had her first retrospective at the Whitney Museum in New York, and I lived in Connecticut, so my mom took me in. There was a long line around the block, and my mom moved us past, and I'm very polite, probably think still today. So she's like, "Mom, we're supposed to get room, like behind everybody else. Wait our turn." She's like, "No, not us." So okay. So we moved up and around to Madison Avenue and walked in the front door, and that's kind of when I was like, "Oh, they're here to see my grandma." And then we got through, and then I got off the elevator, and it was the rainforest. There's all these black sculptures along the walls coming down from the ceiling. There was hanging, some on the floor. And then I just shifted. I understood abstraction. I understood the energy that was coming out of these things. It was all black, and I just got it. But I was not creatively inclined, so I didn't know what that was. It was just this really cool, chilling experience. And then so it sits forever and germinates for years. But that's when I knew she was different. Then I knew I couldn't go back to the other kids in Connecticut and say, "Oh, my, it's famous. I don't want to brag." So there was issues there, but I was very proud of her.
Yeah, that's an amazing experience. And for you, John, what was it like growing up? And Dina, kind of also, the welding came a little bit later. I mean, both women had families, had a kind of domestic life, but then moved, in the case of Nevelson, kind of moved away from that to become an artist. In the case of Dina, still had was still very much, I'm sure, a caretaker and a mother. When did you kind of understand that she had this kind of larger creative life?
Right. When I was growing up, until I left for college, Dina was still very much a painter.
Right.
I left the house in 1979, and she was just starting sculpting then. So what I knew of my mom was that she was a painter, and I would help her stretch her canvases, which made me feel, very, very useful and important. And we did that down in the basement. And then when I went off to college, when she started to take the sculpting more seriously, I was a little bit at a distance from it. But what I knew all along was that my mother was an artist, a professional artist. And for sure, it shaped my growing desire to go to art school myself and become an artist. And you would think that I would get a lot of encouragement from my parents for that. But here's the next anecdote of the day. My father, who is a business professor, was concerned about the viability of his son going into the arts, seeing how difficult it was for his wife to make a living as an artist is a challenging proposition. So while I wanted to go to art school, I definitely got, and my mother was an artist, I got mixed messages about it from my parents. And it took a little finagling, and ultimately I won a scholarship, which is what sent me to art school. But at that point, I will say that there were 2 professional artists in the family, and I got a lot of positive reinforcement. So Dina didn't have that Whitney moment, so I don't have that kind of aha moment with her. But I would just say that all along, we took it as a family very seriously, and she took it seriously from day one, and I just accepted that as who she was.
Right, amazing. I want to talk a little bit about, so obviously there's the fact that they were sculptors, that they each used materials that were kind of at their fingertips and so much in their environment, finding things. They seem to have a very similar approach in terms of this idea of constructing from these disparate elements to create something whole, something holistic. In the case of Dina, often, welding and manipulating metals. In the case of Nevelson, who also worked not just in wood, but in metal, and did a lot of outdoor sculpture in metal, also plexi and like other things. Let's talk a little bit about like the physicality of the work, right, for both of them. I think that when we think about mid-century, mid-20th century sculpture in New York, when we think about Nevelson, it's hard to kind of imagine a woman being as kind of as kind of domineering as men, but physicality. And like looking at both of their stories, we talked a little bit about this as we were talking about both of them together, which is that, they don't adhere to kind of the more traditional feminine. Both of them have such a strength that you can see in the work. There's a physicality and strength to the materials, the scale, the ambition of the work. And then as people, and of course I knew Dina, and from our conversation around Louise, they were also very strong women. There's this great quote about Nevelson hanging out kind of that mid-century, very that that abstract expressionist moment where all the painters and all the guys were hanging out in the Cedar Bar in New York. And someone says to her, a man, it's not identified, but someone says to her, you have to have balls to be a sculptor. To which she apparently replied with a puff of her cigarette, her cigarillo, oh, I have the balls. So I love this because it shows that Nevelson, not only did she make art that she wanted to make, and was of course in control of that, but she understood these perceptions, and she understood that this was perhaps a little bit outside of the tradition and the norm. And she was ready to kind of contend with it. And they both worked with these kind of non-traditional materials that, they weren't hobbyists, they weren't Sunday painters. I mean, Dina did paint, but her paintings too have such a kind of vivaciousness, a strength, a sense of constructing space. There's nothing genteel, let's say, about either of their works, and there's a fearlessness that I get from both of them. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that, about these women who were pioneers in their own way, in their each of their times, and kind of like, where did this fearlessness come from, and how did that kind of feed into their work?
Well, I would say that Louise Nevelson was a great example for Dina, and Dina didn't really think of herself as a woman artist, a feminist artist. She was an artist, and she was, it was about the work, and it was also her frame of reference were simply the artists that she most respected. Louise among them, but the others were mostly men. David Smith and Anthony Caro, Hans Hofmann, Franz Klein. That Abex world was really her sweet spot. So she didn't think that it really wasn't about her gender.
Right.
It's ironic because in her personal life, she was very, as you all know in the room, she was very conscious of being a woman and her, crafting her version of her feminine outlook with clothes and jewelry and hair and like the whole, and it's matched, and so she was very feminine. How she physically made it all happen was pretty fascinating. In her studio, she had an overhead crane with a pulley. She had cinder blocks and bricks to the side. So she would just start assembling sculptures piece by piece as she liked the way something looked. She would tack it temporarily, then add more, holding things up with the cinder blocks in the meantime. And she called what she did drawing in space. So these were drawings to her.
Right.
As opposed to building, she was drawing. And when something was done, it just spoke to her. She understood when to stop. And then at that point, if it was simply too big and heavy, she would ask me to come by, or Jerry, and or my brother Lee, who's watching today, hey Lee, and ask us to help her get it off the table. You know, she didn't really like a lot of assistance. She was very independent in that way as well. But she just wasn't paying attention to, you know, to the practical limitations of scale, or, you know, physical ability, or being a woman in that respect.
Right.
Yeah.
And how about for Louise?
It's similar, and all I can say is that I got a toolbox when I was 5, so that set the stage. I think, you know, like,
Did she give you the toolbox?
no, my father did. I think there was just in the you know, generation, she saw her father building, she identified with it, and then I was given a toolbox. My house was open to just doing what you needed to do, and not to restrict yourself by these mores and conventions that were around you. And of course, my grandmother's dialogue was so strong in the 60s and 70s. I'm hearing it, I'm reading it in Sculpture magazine, and you know, she's shedding all these limitations. So it was really vocalized. But in the end, both these women identified what they needed to pour their energy, their creativity into. And yes, they had some physical restrictions. Maybe they didn't have enough muscles, so they found help. Obviously, my grandmother, when she started to make those big Corten steel pieces that we got across America, that she needed help, and she did. There was a team of wonderful welders at Lippincott Foundry, and so she couldn't have done it without them, or physically, you know. So right, they find ways to make it all work. And I think one of your questions will be, you know, how does it influence us? It just opens us up to not feeling restricted by these outside limitations. So I am very physical around our house. My husband's here. I mean, I'm hammering and painting and carrying on. I don't feel restricted. I have some physical limitations and some quality limitations. I don't attack or do everything. But I think both of them, and actually I have to go on another bit, because Dina and I were at Nexus Foundation for Today's Art. And so when she had her shows, they were in, I could see the connection with my grandmother, but they were so strong, these pieces on the wall. And I just enjoyed seeing that. And I enjoyed seeing that come from a woman who dressed beautifully and feminine, and she had a great figure and everything, you know, matched to us. And then she put these strong things, you go, that's her up there, you know. And I just appreciated seeing it. It was real clear, pure energy out there. There was nothing. It was really a joy.
It's great to hear it from the third party. Like we had our perception of it, but this little insight, it's very gratifying.
It was strong, very strong. So it's nice.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk also about how both Louise and Dina gained success and recognition later in life. You know, we talked a little bit about how with the Whitney show, but I'm curious, kind of, if John, if you want to talk a little bit about Dina, who I think you mentioned was very much inspired by Nevelson in that way. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Definitely. I think, as you said, first there was raising a family, and so Dina was, you know, getting into her art journey as a painter while we were at home. But it was 1983 was, I think, give or take a year, the year that my brother left the house. 1985 is when she joined Nexus, and a year later Viridian Gallery in New York. So this was all an empty nester career. And then she, you know, dug into it really, really deeply. But she used to tell us, she said, well, Louise Nevelson didn't have her first show until her 40s. So I'm okay, I'm on track. And really, that was just, you know, a mantra. And myself, you know, I have my jewelry business, and I have a studio art practice, and the studio art practice is a much slower journey. And I tell myself, well, Louise Nevelson didn't do this, and Dina didn't do that, so I feel like I'm okay too. And then I was thinking about this in advance, and because once Dina had a very rich career and, you know, produced a lot of great work, but she never really had that commercial success that Louise found.
Right.
And what ended up happening was, you wouldn't have really predicted it, but Dina at one point in the early 2000s basically said, you know what, I'm done with it. I'm not going to worry about that kind of commercial success anymore. I'm going to stop making discrete objects that can be sold, that a gallery can show easily. I'm just gonna trust my gut and start working in a bigger, more experimental way. And with that, she started doing these room-sized installations that, in retrospect, really, were the absolute pinnacle of her career as a sculptor.
Yeah.
And it was only because she wasn't finding the traditional success that she was conditioned to look for that door opened.
Right, exactly. And I did want to talk about scale for their work, which we talked a little bit about just in terms of what's expected, right? And I think one thing you both made so clear in terms of those kind of gender normative expectations, that they just didn't really think about them or think about being limited by them, by those expectations. So certainly Nevelson throughout her career made many kind of public sculptures and very large scale sculptures. How did she kind of think about those in contrast to kind of more a smaller scale work, or we were talking about like the cryptic, the cryptics and smaller boxes? How did she kind of, and also the material change, to bronze and things. And we talked a little bit about the work that, has been outside the PMA up until fairly recently for a very long time. Could you talk a little bit more about the public works that Louise made?
Yeah, so she's working interior and smaller scale. She had a great gallery dealer, Arnie Globsher, who they worked beautifully together. He still works with her artwork very, very well. And he would bring her new materials as they were coming on, plexiglass, whatever, but Corten steel eventually came along. And she said she would go to the foundry up in North Haven, Connecticut at the Lippincott foundry, and it was intimidating, this metal, and she wanted to be tight with it, I guess, little maquettes and drawings to do whatever. But she knew that it would allow her to do outdoor pieces and go bigger. And so she got comfortable with it, and eventually she decided it was just as good as butter. She could maneuver that Corten steel. So it became natural. So she started in the beginning with these maquettes or tight little constructions that were 12 feet, but eventually she could go to the foundry because she's like in her moments, and she could just pull from the stack and whatever was laying around. They say, "Hey, Louise, not that one. That was George Sugarman's piece. You can't touch that." She would just start pulling, and then they would tack them right there. And so it was a real energy flow going, and spontaneous, which is so exciting with artwork. And she kept going bigger and bigger and bigger. So the one at the art museum that was there was 18 feet high. The Louise Nevelson Plaza in Lower Manhattan has one that's 40 feet high. There's 7, but the tallest is 40 feet high. And I remember I brought a friend to the park in Plaza in New York, and she'd heard about my grandmother. She saw that 40-foot high sculpture, and she went, "A woman made that?"
That plaza is an amazing pilgrimage site. Yeah, I just love it.
Thank you. Yeah, it is. Of course, for me, it's like go visit grandma for a while in her park. But yeah, so that's a gender altering thing, and also being able to work with a very masculine material that, and then just blow it out and work into a whole environment, which is also what was coming later in life, like well, not later, but I guess later in her life, when 1958 she started really create these environments, which is what your mother also was doing. They were getting so fluent with this material and their style that they create these environments that we were left with. So you mentioned before Moon Garden +1 at Grand Central Moderns in 1958, and then they went to 1959 at the Museum of Modern Art with Dawn's Wedding Feast, and all the white, like the sculpture with a white interior. And then she ended up at the Venice Biennale in 1962 and created 3 environments, one gold, one white, one black. So she's doing this environmental thing, architect of environment or whatever, but it was that need, and I find that interesting with your mother also, that she would work a whole room. Now I've done interior design, and I know there's another interior designer in the room here, and we work rooms, you know, I used to do that. It was fun, you know, it was every element from ceiling, floor to ceiling, walls, baseboards, whatever, it's fun. But they were doing this with their artwork,
Right.
so it's so much more fluid and freed up. What a wonderful thing for them, but also for us to experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Dina, I remember reading about inspiration coming, maybe was it after a visit to Storm King, or kind of this kind of, or it's kind of looking at larger scale sculpture and thinking, you know, I think it's so wonderful to, one of my favorite things about working with artists is seeing them work in one scale, one form, one media, and watching them experiment with transferring all those ideas, and not necessarily, it doesn't always have to be bigger, but into some other different format, some other different realization, but there's this through line. And I think the other thing is about both of these artists, if you see, let's say, what we call an autonomous object that our body can walk around, or an environment by Louise Nevelson, there's no mistaking it. The work is so recognizable, it is so iconic, you know. And for Dina too, I think it's actually what's interesting is the collection that Dina and Jerry built together. There's a lot of affinities in the room with Dina's work, but you can always tell when it's Dina's work versus many of the other artists. So yeah, I'm just curious if we can talk a little bit more about, and maybe even like the more recent installation of the sculpture at the Woodmere Art Museum, which seems to be kind of like a realization of this idea of a big public sculpture.
Exactly. So Dina and Jerry went to Talik's Foundry and explored what would be the logistics inspired by the work at Storm King and, you know, other urban huge sculptures. Dina loved the public engagement and the interaction and the idea that, you know, there was a kind of an art for all aspect to it, and started to imagine her own sculptures as maquettes for future enlargements. So that was very much, you know, on her mind, and something that she looked forward to pursuing over time. Well, unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. And when she passed away, there was still this, you know, this vision, and there was an awful lot of goodwill in the community, in the art world. And so we'll talk a little bit later about the Dina Wind Art Foundation, but one of our projects has been partnering with Woodmere Art Museum and Grounds for Sculpture so far, and realizing the enlargement of 2 of her maquettes from literally 26 inches to 26 feet, or 30 to 30. And these pieces are a very emotional realization of the vision that she had. And like, I get to go visit my mom now when I'm at Woodmere or Grounds for Sculpture.
Well, great. I'm glad you mentioned the foundations, because I do want to talk about that. You each run foundations in the name of these great artists. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to run a foundation, to found one, to start one, what it's like on a day-to-day basis, and what are the goals and missions of each one of the foundations that you run? Maybe Marie,
Let's start with
yeah.
Your foundation's been around longer.
Right.
Yeah, and it's an unusual one. So I started in 2005 because there was, I started to be asked to give lectures and talks on my grandmother, and then people said, well, we need more information, and then I don't know, the internet, and then people started, I need a photographer, or where do I get information, or how do I get a hold of Pace Gallery? So I realized it needed to be a nexus, a source, Nexus Foundation for today's art comes again. It was a good training ground for me, I guess, so that people could find information about my grandmother. It just wasn't available. And so it started, but I had also been working for years on a catalog raisonné just because I'm interested in oral histories. I had already been taking, you know, a little here and there. So it was time to pull all this together, and it did come together earlier than I wanted to. And in typical fashion for me, I jump in and I just do it. I do a little research, boom, I'm in there and start walking. And so I didn't know what would happen and how it would carry on. And now it's gotten to a form where I can do it mostly myself, because if focus on doing special projects. And these special projects, one's been ongoing with the Getty Conservation Institute, where we're developing a paint for my grandmother's outdoor sculptures that's long-term, durable, stands up to, you know, city kids jumping all over, whatever. And so that's in the works. And then Celine, the fashion house, came to me 2 years ago and said, well, let's make a pendant. And so that was a very cool process, and working with them was a very awesome experience, a great group of people. And it's a special project. And then most recently working on this Venice Biennale project, and after 60 years, seeing my grandmother back at the Venice Biennale, and this gorgeous 9-room exhibition showing early work to later work, which is just gorgeous to see in itself, but it was nice to do that. So I get pulled into these special projects. That's what I'm calling them. Yes, I'm having a hard time doing it all. And yes, there's paperwork, and I'm filing with the states for registrations, and I've got to file for PA this and, you know, whatever. This is, it's all there, and somehow you do it. And, you know, I don't see a lot of people, and I like it, actually. Somebody reminded me the other day that I created it.
Right.
And I'm busy. Well, you created it, so you got it. So that's my story.
But you are really the only person. Do you have any help? Do you have any interns?
No,
We'll
I've
find you
had
some
them once.
interns.
I find them once in a while. Yeah, I need help. I really, if I wanted it to grow bigger, yes, interns, but I don't like managing people. It's not really something. I want to do the work. Yeah, I need help. I definitely need help to keep growing, but I'm doing what I can.
Yeah,
and it's been good so far.
Just learning so much through this process about what you do. It's really admirable and incredibly ambitious for the scale, but it's you know, it's important to say that Nevelson is such a big name. But the foundation that follows the artist is not always, it's not always the Warhol Foundation. It's not always, you know, Rauschenberg. There are foundations that are doing major work with major artists with more limited time and staff and resources. And a lot of it is about holding the legacy and and doing projects now that will lay the groundwork for that legacy to be, you know, around for years to come. So first of all, many conservators will thank you about the paint project.
I know they do. They can't wait to get the formula. I say now, what I'm doing is for 50 years from now. So I'm 62. I'm not going to be here in 50 years. I'm trying to do things, plant them. I did oral histories. I gave one to the Archives of American Art. That's where so I don't want to hold these things. I'm different as a foundation. These are things I'm going to plant, so that they stay for out there for a long time. So
well, let's hear a little bit about your foundation, and then we'll bring Jerry on to ask him some questions.
Well, our foundations there's similarities and there's differences. The similarity, of course, is that our goal is to nurture Dina's legacy and get her work out there and you know, for a new generation to discover. The difference is that you're working with an artist whose work is dispersed among you know, many collections around the world. Dina's work is, some of it is out there, but much of it is in our own archives. So we own a lot of work, and you don't, but your work, the value is different than our work. So it's kind of interesting, but we have two primary goals. One is the legacy piece of it. And then the second is to continue doing the civic work that Jerry and Dina together were so passionate about, supporting living artists and art organizations in the Philadelphia region and beyond. And my father is still very much in the game, and we work on it together, but we decided to formalize it under the Dina Wind Art Foundation in Dina's memory and as a vehicle to continue doing this work forward. And as Johanna said in the introduction, the foundation's vision is to empower differences and transform lives. And my parents have always had this mantra about the power of art to facilitate those exact things. And so in our small way, our little foundation with our little budget, we're trying to, you know, get a lot of bang for the buck and make things happen.
Amazing. Well, with that, should we invite Jerry to join
Yeah,
us? Jerry, why don't you
absolutely.
come and sit next to Maria?
You're the next contestant on the
Yeah.
Price is Right.
So again, thank you so much, Jerry, for letting us use your home today as a stage. And you have this
Great to have you.
extraordinary Nelson behind you, and we should also mention behind John is the work by Dina. So we're literally ensconced in the legacies of these artists. So of course we have another very unique and very intimate perspective on the artist of these work for Dina. Jerry having been married to Dina for many a decade. Can you tell us a little bit about how, from your perspective, Dina kind of grew as an artist and how you thought about collecting art together? I'm so curious about how Dina was as a collector in addition to being an artist, and would love to just hear your thoughts about her and her creative life.
Well, she started with the fact that when she went to elementary school, her teacher told her she has no talent for art because she insisted that she will draw some vase or something, and Dina had a hard time drawing exactly the way the teacher wanted. So this was kind of the back of the mind. And when we moved to Philadelphia, I think one of the first things that she did was join the Barnes Foundation for 2 years for the program with Mr. Mazia, which really changed her life. We always liked art. I remember when we first married, we kind of bought our first print on one of our trips. And so I always liked art. But I think the real influence on Dina's art was the Barnes Foundation. And then she never, until then, she really never thought of herself as being an artist. She was talking about possibility of going back to work as a sociologist, and search. But then, she was really changed with the Barnes Foundation. Really changed her life. And then she started taking courses in painting with St. Feinstein. And if you walk around the house, you can see some of the paintings in different places here. But as John said, the transforming part was the sculpting, the kind of the fact. And I think what made her, so attracted to sculpture, the ability to find objects, have tons of objects in the studio, and then try to put them all together until they spoke to her. She never drew any of the sculptures before.
Right.
She always worked very intuitively with the material, put the material together, and later on, when the sculpture was done, then she used to draw it, some of them. And actually later in life, when it was a little too difficult to continue welding with the mask and everything else, what she did is kind of the last phase of work of her was she took some of her old drawings of sculptures, tore them, and created three-dimensional paper sculptures.
Amazing.
So there's some in my room, so those who are here can see it. And Marsha actually installed one of them at the Perelman Center.
That's right.
The university museum. There is one of the sculptures there. So she was really intrigued with the beauty of putting things together.
Right.
The collection of art was, we just love art. In my view of art is you fall in love with a piece of art, you want to have it.
So whose idea was it to start collecting Nevelson's work?
I don't know, it came, I think this
Sorry,
we
like
saw,
organic, yeah.
I think we saw the pieces, that we saw the, I was never attracted to the traditional Nevelson kind of boxes, but when we saw the piece in the TV room, the kind of the large explosive Nevelson, it spoke to us. I saw it that we have to have it. And actually, those who are here, you can see, we built the room actually around it. We're planning to build a.
That was going to be one of my questions. One of my questions, I always ask collectors, do you buy for your walls or do you make walls for the art that you buy?
But we're planning to add a family room, a TV room, because I took from my study what they originally was supposed to be a family room. And then when we saw this piece, we said, okay, we have to design the room so this can fit this. So the room's really designed for, and everything around this piece, so the piece was really the centerpiece.
So the work that Jerry's talking about, and I'm now the date is 1985.
Yeah.
So late in Nevelson's career, Nevelson passes away in 88, I believe, and is a work that is literally unbounded from the grid, from the box. So that there's a box in it. There's this little gesture toward the box in it, and it really is explosive. Is really the best word for it, and it's massive. So I always like to ask, when I see a work like that in a collector's house, you always have to ask, did you have this wall already or not? And it's a real testament to collectors when they literally build around their collection. How about the work that's behind us, which is a little bit earlier, is a 76?
76, this was during the Centennial Dome. We saw it later, we bought it later. This was after the big black piece. I always was attracted to the columns.
Yeah.
You know, the columns, you know, kind of I always thought they were kind of the statement. And we were looking for one because I never find the right one. And then we saw this one, and this was so dominant. So the only question is, do we have it high enough ceiling to have it? We said, yeah, this room can fit.
Just high enough, yeah. I love actually where it's positioned right now, because you know, these works are meant to be the work that we mentioned before, which is all black, the 1986 work. Is a wall work, so it's mounted on the wall. This is, of course, it's a total 360. You know, you're meant to walk around it. So on one hand, it's inside this room, but on the other hand, it's on the other side of the window. You can still walk around it. So can you tell us a little bit about how Dina looked at art? You know, what got Dina excited when you were, you know, whether it was an exhibition or you happened to stop in a gallery, you know, and I would just love to hear a little bit more about her own relationship to other artists and other artworks.
I think first was the overall gestalt, because it's really, you know, she loved the piece.
Yeah.
The aesthetics of the piece was really important, really spoke to her. She was ahead of her time at the latest with Imperial.
Yeah.
She was really focusing on the beauty, the piece had to speak to her. And once it did, then she started looking at the details.
Right.
How was it well done? How was it done? And related. And she always related the art pieces to other art pieces, whether with the same artist or others.
Yeah.
The word gutsy. She liked things that were gutsy.
Gutsy. I like that. I like that. So things that might be unexpected or take some kind of risk.
And you can see it in her work.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always something that is, you know, the work is incredibly bold in that way. And for both Nevelson and when you look at it, there's this totality, as we were talking about this overall construction, but then you start focusing on all these details, and this kind of the imagination really kind of takes hold.
But interesting, a point you did not kind of elaborate on when you talked about the room size installation. A lot of them were driven by more social conscious and addressing environmental issues.
Right. Yeah.
For Dina. So while when she looked at art, it was the aesthetics of this. When she created art, especially once she moved beyond the kind of the individual pieces, which was kind of, you know, she enjoyed really doing, and into installation, it was really a statement, kind of an environmental statement.
Right. Yeah, there's so many ways within the history of art to use things that came before, right? Of course, you know, I feel like we can't escape the conversation without talking about Duchamp and this idea of ready-made, but for both in which, you know, using works were commercially or readily available, or objects are readily available, and kind of calling them more art in a more conceptual way, but for both Nevelson and for both Louise and Dina, it was so material. And for Nevelson, it sounds like it was a fact of life to kind of find this wood on the street. And it wasn't to her trash or detritus, it was possibility.
Well, it was affordable for her.
Yes.
And then she transformed
And she
it.
transformed it.
And she didn't see it for what it was, a wooden spoon or a
Yeah.
toilet seat, as she would say sometimes, but yeah, but that was really accessible.
Right. And
That's very similar to Dina,
yeah.
because she used to go to places to look for scrap. So when she got them, there was no idea what will happen with them. So it was basically all this crap flying around the studio, and then she was going shopping in the studio, finding out and start putting things
the
together.
right bits and bobs to put together.
One thing that Dina wrote was that it's her role as an artist to take society's discards. You know, once an object, a shiny car or an appliance or tool, you know, has outlived its useful life, that's when the artist can step in and create a transformation and add value and give it a new life.
Yeah.
And so that was, I think, in the back of her mind in all of the work that she created.
Yeah, I love that. And it's been interesting spending a little bit more time with the reflection today, and artists like, you know, Armand, you know, who really literally collected from, they used to call him, his wife Grace told me they used to call him like the saint of, there's a certain area where he went to all the thrift stores and first reading now, but this idea of finding what's been discarded by others and incorporate it into the work. This idea of accumulation. For Armand, it was a kind of taxonomy. You know, you have an Armand with all the paint tubes, right? So, you know, maybe he found all of them at the same time, but more than likely he kept a whole thing of, you know, a paint tube almost catalog, and then, you know, put them all together. And so this idea of use and reuse, but also serendipity, right? You know, finding something that it could just be a strange looking piece of metal to one person, and to Dina, it has that vigor, it has that life, it has that, you know, is it interesting? I love that from the abstract guys. And then for Nevelson, picking things up and bringing to the studio and starting to kind of compose them together and figuring out how one disparate thing can talk to another and can bring them together in the sculpture. So, you know, maybe it's not as much from an environmental standpoint, which really probably wasn't a thing back then.
Not in the beginning.
You know, but this idea of taking from life and bringing it into art is such a long and vital tradition that they're both very much involved in. Well, it's 5 o'clock, so I would love to seg into questions from the audience. For those of you watching online, unfortunately, we cannot take your questions via Zoom, so you're going to have to listen and hope someone asks your question. But if anyone here in the room has questions for John, for Maria, or for Jerry, we would love to hear them at this point.
I'm just wondering, John, if you think that the welding mask helped your mom go into that fourth dimension. It was sort of her world, you know, in other words, that took her to this zone. Do you think, Jerry, do you think that was at all?
I'm just gonna, for if people are watching, I'm just gonna repeat the question, so we're gonna definitely hear, which is, the question is, when Dina put on that welding mask, was that her way to kind of reach that fourth dimensional moment, the kind of zone in her artwork as she was making her artwork?
Well, be interesting to hear John's reaction. Mine is now, I think she got the high from as she was building, you know, think about this, you have a lot of components around you, so putting them together, and as a set starts looking good, that's what she started getting the high. So it was the building process, you know, the more she built, the more it kind of appeals to her. And then she may have even changed it later on once she started welding, because it did not look as good, so we'll change and kind of redo it. So to me, it was the process. She really enjoyed the process.
Well, I'm gonna disagree respectfully and say, honestly, I'd never thought of it before, but she had this steel locker in her studio, and she had her suede like butcher's apron, and she had her denim overalls, and she had these enormous protective gloves, and she had her welding helmet and her goggles. And, you know, she would come in from her, you know, her other life and remove her, you know, her street clothes and put on her armor. And I believe that we never talked about it, but there was a ritual. In that ritual was this, like, you know, putting on her superhero costume, and it prepared her for what was ahead. And Dina always had a perfect manicure and, you know, hair and makeup, and you just had to wonder, like, where is this coming from, and how does she reconcile that? So yeah, part of the reconciling was by concealing and protecting, and then she was ready to go tackle those materials.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Good question.
You have another question?
The work of Louise and Dina has always been very meaningful to me, but even more so significant today in this country, this chaotic country and the chaotic world. I'm wondering if Dina and Louise talked about the process of being bringing order to disorder. Was that ever part of the conversation?
I think so with my
Because that's the
grandmother.
power of what they did ultimately.
I was listening to an interview, and she, mentioned it was like New York in the 70s was full of drugs, crime, dirt, and so she was aware of that. She didn't want to leave New York. She loved New York, thought it was a real energy center, and is, and so making that artwork giving her probably some break from what was out in the street, which could be rather brutal and hard on you, but she created her own environment, and it was I'm not trying to find the words, but I think that's answering your question. Is that it's creating her own environment, her own haven, where she was comfortable out of what was going on out in the world. Which did Dina?
Well, I think for Dina, especially with her her installations, she wasn't trying to create order, but rather change the way we saw the chaos. And by curating it, by bringing it into the gallery, there was a different kind of transformation going on. And I think that's what she was after with these like hanging gardens of Babylon,
Right.
which was kind of like a butcher shop of flanks of cars and tires and everything hanging from a grid in the ceiling. There wasn't like an order to it, but it definitely changed the way you looked at these materials.
But
What do you think, Deb?
I agree. I think the very similar would be, especially with the piece of the Black Islands, which does really so. It's now owned by the West Collection, and the West Island was an installation in Nexus actually, which is cluster of sculptures. And she did it differently. It was not really the traditional found object. She got fenders and she rolled them. She got them flattened and rolled, and then she painted them, and then threw rubber paint on this. And well, for her, it was like a political statement about what's happening with the oil kind of empire and
Geopolitics.
the geopolitics of oil, and trying to show it in an orderly, beautiful setting, as opposed to the mess that they kind of the geopolitics of oil. So yeah, I can see that, especially when she dealt with the environmental sculptures.
Great question. Thank you.
I think that what you just said distinguishes the time in which Dina was working and the time in which Louise Nevelson was working, as far as the art world goes. And that is that during Nevelson's period, it seemed to be all about the art. I mean, in other words, it was not a political statement, not a statement about anything except the object. I mean, Ab-X, all those things that were happening weren't talking about the environment, politics, gasoline, and the pollution. And I think the world Dina was working in, this was later, really sort of is emblematic of what happened. Maybe Erica, you can speak to this, about how art changed and artists changed and became much more sort of socially, not that we weren't socially conscious before, but how the art became more socially conscious. Is that pretty well known, or?
I think I think it's just to summarize for anyone watching online, the kind of the proposition, maybe more than a question.
Where it was social conscious.
Right, is that kind of looking at New York during Nevelson's time, let's say 50s and 70s versus the art world in Dina's time, I think in general the world itself has changed. And so like things like environment, climate, that was not really, I think, wasn't the main concern in the 50s, 60s, 70s. In terms of the artists who were hanging out the Cedar Tavern, I mean, these were like artists that talked about art,
Right, it's about
and
the art.
it wasn't to say it was dissociated from life, because I think if you think about artists like the Amex, artists, it's finding these emotive forms, which were very much about, certainly not identity politics as we know it, but exploring other aspects of the self. And that was very kind of primary. And then I think like as art moved along, it kind of picks up other concerns, but also the world changes so much,
Well, I'll pick up on that because my grandmother did homage to 6 million Jews, homage to the universe.
Yeah.
So that was her time and her processing of what was going on in her world. So, and then Dina picked up with her time, which my grandma always said, she's a mirror of her time. She's, we all are. And so that's another connection with Dina and my grandmothers are both very well internalizing what was going on around them and then leaving it with us, what was important at their time. So,
right. Which I think also about like the idea of, post-war New York, and becoming this creative center. And this is actually a cycle that's been, people have been talking about more recently, that after recession, after war, after all these things, the creative life, the creative fabric of society tends to kind of shine because it is a different way of living. It's it's not necessarily post-COVID, like that's a big conversation right now. But certainly after World War II, there's a sort of a social and political awareness of coming out of that moment, and works like Nevelson's in homage to the 6 million, of course, are directly related to that. But other things, things that are a little more kind of like the geopolitical, the sense of like globalism and kind of being much more kind of interconnected. Of course, modern artists were incredibly global and incredibly interworld. Maybe then they would call it international in terms of traveling in amongst, different countries and understanding kind of what else is happening. But the connectivity is, you have to understand, is much slower. It's body to body, it's person to person, it's traveling. In Dina's world, it's, it's the media age. So everything kind of changes, the alacrity changes, the global concern, understanding what's not just happening in your own backyard, but globally, it's just more accessible and becomes a little bit more of the kind of potential content for, an artist or even, us as kind of citizens of the world. Let's take, if there's one last question or comment before anyone on this side. No?
We've
All
got
right,
here.
just one more.
I just have to remark, it's not really a question, but the muscularity
Yeah,
of these two women never ceases to amaze me. Intellectually, what they were, they took real physicality, and I just think it's so remarkable.
A quick comment of this. When they opened the Women's Museum in Washington, Dina really had a hard time with this. Because someone asked her, do you want to participate, get involved? And she says, no. I want people to appreciate my art.
yeah,
The fact that I'm a woman doesn't make any difference.
right.
They should evaluate the art and look at the art. And she was always looking actually for powerful, but we talked before about the kind of the collecting. When we looked at art, she always was attracted to kind of powerful art. I remember, and I really lagged behind her in terms of being able to see some of the great. I remember we saw a show of Soutine in Paris, and she loved it. And I think that the Hanging Garden piece that you were referring to earlier was definitely influenced by Soutine work. And I could not relate to this, but she loved the kind of the strength of the piece.
So when you say that aesthetics were important to her aesthetics is in the eye of the beholder, because Soutine is hardly a Matisse. It's not pretty. Right.
Yeah, it was not the prettiness, it was the what appeal, you know, so to her, Soutine appeal.
Soutine was literally gutsy.
It was
Yeah.
that.
He was gutsy, all right.
Well, thank you so much, John, Maria, and Jerry. Thank you to our live studio audience today, and also to Joanna. Thank you so much for joining.